Yeah, Sui. Yeah, Sui. An academic definition that suffices fucking fro that's reading from a website. When there's the properties of morals themselves, we call sui generis. That's what I was looking for. But yeah, I don't want to get into all the terminology and stuff.
All right, let's slow this down and make it simple. Praise says morality comes from Sui Generis properties. Sounds fancy, right? Let's break it down.
Well, sui means of its own. Generis means kind or category. Put together, sui generis means a thing that belongs to its own category, unique, irreducible, and not part of anything else.
And here's the spicy part. This idea comes straight out of atheistic moral philosophy, not Christianity. Praise reads academic papers the same way he reads the Bible. He grabs a phrase, ignores the context, and builds a doctrine out of it. So where did Praise get this idea? A couple years ago, he debated Mark on morality. In the process, he stumbled across an incredible scholar, Jessica Katz, a metaethicist who wrote her PhD thesis analyzing competing moral theories.
Katz is the real deal. She's not doing theology. She's not doing apologetics. She's doing high-level analytic philosophy.
The only good thing Praise did was introduce Katz to the community. The bad news? He didn't understand her paper at all.
And honestly, that's not surprising. This is a PhD thesis, dense, technical, and written for professional philosophers. It's not exactly bedtime reading for someone who struggles with basic definitions.
Here's a key mistake. Praise cherry-picked one line from Katz, a line where she's describing G. Moore's view, not her own.
Katz writes that Moorean non-naturalists believe moral properties like goodness and rightness are sui generis, unique, irreducible, and non-natural. That's in Chapter 1, pages 3 to 4.
But Praise grabbed that line, ignored the fact that Katz was describing an atheist theory, and then preached it as if it were Christian theology. He turned Moore's anti-DCT argument into a pro-DCT argument. It's like quoting an atheist and saying, "See? This proves God."
Katz included Moore's view because she was laying out the landscape of moral theories. She wasn't endorsing it. She was explaining it so she could later evaluate it.
She's doing what every good philosopher does. Step 1, present the opposing view accurately. Step 2, show how your preferred theory can answer it. Katz took on Moorean realism because Moore was the one who tried to overturn divine command theory. Moore said moral properties are sui generis and independent of God.
That's an atheistic or agnostic moral stance. Moore believed moral properties exist on their own, not grounded in God, not caused by God, not identical to God.
So Katz wasn't promoting Moore. She was defending DCT against Moore. Praise flipped it upside down. He took the atheist argument and preached it as if it were Christian doctrine. So in the end, Praise didn't just misunderstand Katz. He accidentally adopted an atheist moral theory, called it supernatural, and used it to defend Christianity. That's not theology. That's not philosophy. That's a doctrinal faceplant. One of the biggest reasons we're doing this breakdown is simple: fact-checking. Because in this community, we've got people like Vekl, who doesn't fact-check anything. He just hears Praise say a big word like sui generis and goes, "Oh wow, that must be deep theology."
Yeah, Vekl treats Praise like a theological GPS. Even when Praise drives straight into a ditch, Vekl's still in the passenger seat going, recalculating. Praise is still right.
And then he recommends Praise to everyone else like he's the next Aquinas. Meanwhile, Praise is out here confusing G. Moore, the atheist who tried to destroy DCT, with Jessica Katz, the scholar who explains more so she can offend DCT's plausibility.
So Vekl basically said, hey everyone, check out this guy who can't tell the difference between Christian ethics and atheist metaethics. That's like recommending a chef who can't tell salt from sugar.
All right, let's explain what we're doing in this video. We're not reviewing Praise's entire debate. That would take 6 hours and a medical team.
We're focusing on two things only: Praise's version of divine command theory and Praise's use, or misuse, of one scholar, Jessica Katz.
And why just these two? Because they're so far off the rails that we don't need anything else. Praise gives us everything we need to show the problem, in context, in his own words, and in glorious high-definition confusion.
Exactly. If we covered the whole debate, we'd need popcorn, intermissions, and a support group. But his DCT and his use of cats? That's enough material to fill a semester of What Not to Do in Philosophy 101.
So buckle up, grab your coffee, and prepare your eyebrows, because they're about to raise themselves.
We're diving straight into Praise's divine command theory, his accidental adoption of G.E. Moore's atheist moral realism, and his complete misreading of Katz's Chapter 1, pages 3 to 4.
This is where philosophy gets wild, the theology gets confused, and the fact-checking becomes a public service.
Let's do this.
All right. So go ahead and start it now. So morality comes from God, divine command theory. That'll be my thesis tonight. So my thesis is surrounded on the divine command theory. But here's the formula, the conventional divine command theory formula. If God commands X, and X is obligatory, and if X is obligatory, then it is because God commands or commanded X. That is to say, if some act X is morally obligatory, God has commanded X, and if God commands X, then X is in virtue of God's command morally obligatory. Hence, God's commands are objectively binding to all people. However, I'm going to refer to or appeal to JMD Katz, and she is a PhD philosopher, but she modifies the divine command theory into two theses that dispels any circularity. So there's the ideal command theory may be characterized by a commitment to the following two theses. The command part of this, or the command thesis of the divine command I'm appealing to is moral obligation, just as what God would command. But then there's the good part of the divine command as well, being good just as resemblance to God's nature.
All right, let's take a look at Praise's divine command theory. Here's what he says, and I'm quoting him exactly. If God commands X, then X is obligatory. And if X is obligatory, then it is because God commanded X. That's not a moral theory. That's a philosophical hamster wheel.
Right. That's like saying, the light is on because the switch is up, and the switch is up because the light is on. It just spins in a circle until you get dizzy.
And then he doubles down. If some act X is morally obligatory, God has commanded X. And if God commands X, then X is morally obligatory. Praise basically reinvented the Euthyphro dilemma and then lost himself.
And the funniest part? He thinks this circular loop is a defense of the Christian God. But every Christian philosopher who actually works on DCT, Robert Adams, Yale, William Alston, Syracuse, Philip Quinn, Notre Dame, all reject this circular version because it makes morality arbitrary.
So Praise's DCT isn't Christian, isn't philosophical, and isn't coherent. It's just a loop with God's name taped to it. And then, suddenly, Praise says the magic word. However, PhD philosopher Jessica Katz. And right there, I realized something. The last part of slide, that's straight out of Katz's dissertation.
Which means he had the correct solution to his circular DCT right in front of him when he made his PowerPoint, and still chose the wrong version.
Katz gives a modified DCT, based on the work of Robert Adams, that actually avoids circularity. Here's how she summarizes it. And this is fact-checkable in her dissertation, Chapter 1. Moral obligation equals what God would command. Goodness equals resemblance to God's nature.
Notice the difference? Praise's version says, X is obligatory because God commands it, and God commands it because X is obligatory. That's a circle.
But Katz's version says, obligations come from God's commands. Goodness comes from God's nature, and the two are not identical, so there's no circularity.
And this is why Katz's version is more probable, more coherent, and more Christian. It's the version defended by Robert Adams, Yale, William Alston, Syracuse, C. Stephen Evans, Baylor. All fact-checkable in their published works.
So let's be clear. Praise had the correct, academically respected, theologically sound version of DCT right in front of him, and instead he chose a circular one that collapses under its own weight.
He could have just read Katz's paragraph and been done. But instead, he built a theological pretzel and then tried to pass it off as Christian philosophy.
Katz fixed a problem. Adams fixed a problem. Christian philosophers fixed a problem. Praise recreated the problem. Now here's the part Praise completely missed. Jessica Katz's version of divine command theory, the one he quoted but didn't understand, actually supports Christian theism far better than his circular version ever could.
Katz follows the same structure used by respected Christian philosophers like Robert Adams and C. Stephen Evans. And their approach is simple.
Goodness comes from God's nature. Obligation comes from God's commands.
Two different things. No circle. No loop. No philosophical hamster wheel.
And here's why this supports Christian theism. If goodness is grounded in God's nature, then morality isn't arbitrary. It's not random. It's not good because God said so. It's good because God is good.
And obligations, those come from God's commands, which makes sense. A good God commands what reflects his nature. That's coherent. That's biblical. That's Christian.
Katz's version gives you a morally perfect God, a stable foundation for goodness, a clear grounding for obligation, and a theory that avoids circularity. It's everything Praise wanted, and it was literally sitting in the paragraph he read. Now, let's talk about the elephant tap dancing in the room. Praise is free grace theology.
Free grace says, no obligations, no binding commands, no moral duties, no requirements for believers. Everything is grace, grace, grace.
But as divine command theory says, God's commands are objectively binding to all people. All people. No exceptions. No loopholes. No free grace escape hatch.
So Praise is preaching a theology where
God's commands bind everyone, but believers have no obligations. But obligations come from commands. But commands don't bind believers. This is not theology. This is theological twister.
Katz's version of DCT actually fits Christian theism. Praise's version contradicts Christian theism and contradicts his own free grace doctrine. He built a moral system that refutes his own preaching. Let's recap Praise's divine command theory journey, because honestly, it's been a ride.
Step 1. He starts with a circular DCT that collapses faster than a folding chair at a family reunion.
Step 2. He quotes Katz, the scholar who literally fixes a problem, and somehow still chooses a broken version.
Step 3. He grabs G.E. Moore's atheist moral realism, calls it supernatural, and uses it to defend Christianity. That's like using a vegan cookbook to defend barbecue.
Step 4. He contradicts his own free grace theology by insisting God's commands are binding on everyone, including the people he says have no obligations.
Step 5. He presents all of this with total confidence, as if confidence can substitute for coherence.
So in the end, Praise didn't just misunderstand Katz. He misunderstood DCT, misunderstood Moore, misunderstood his own theology, and misunderstood the assignment.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you turn a moral argument into a moral comedy.
So, the unique metaphysical justification of moral realism, divine command theory, is, let's see here. Yeah, Sui Generis. So sui generis, supernatural properties. So morals have sui generis and supernatural properties. So PhD J.M. Katz explains, by contrast, non-natural properties are generally held to be causally impotent and not discoverable by the empirical or scientific methods. Examples of non-natural properties include sui generis and supernatural properties. A different in kind from any other property, moral properties that are sui generis are thus non-reductive, irreducibly normative properties that can be explained as supernatural properties in divine command theory because they challenge existing scientific principles such as the causal closure principle, which states that all causes of physical events are physical. For example, if it is a moral fact that all acts of unconditional love are good, it is because all instances of unconditional love have the property of being good. And what we mean by unique entails that the moral constituents of moral facts, moral properties, or their instances fall into a metaphysical category of their own, and thus are sui generis. Sui generis is a moral entity. It is metaphysically unique or sui generis insofar as it is neither reducible to or identical to, nor metaphysically continuous with any other kind of entity. So, recap of why morality comes from God. Just one moral fact in reality needs to be true or false propositionally for moral realism to be true. That has been demonstrated, because to say there are no moral facts itself would become an objective moral fact and be self-defeating. Certainty is irrelevant because it's a property of persons. There are no defeaters of divine command theory, and hence phenomenological conservatism states a person is rationally justified in believing something with the absence of defeaters. Hence, the moral experience of divine command theorists is justified. A priori, here's another point of the presentation tonight. A priori morality that is true beforehand and not discoverable inductively, has been demonstrable with pre-rooted morality in babies, and the proposition
30 seconds.
It would be wrong not to do something, or one not ought to do. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy states the proposition is a priori. More responsibility requires Causa sui free will, which M. Shurish in his paper Springer showed as an emergent property of the material soul. J.M. Katz and many others have shown moral properties such as rightness, wrongness, goodness, and badness, and sui generis properties that are queer, unique, and natural properties. Hence, they are non-natural properties because they are non-reductive, normative, and not discoverable by the scientific method. The fact they violate causal closure principle means they are supranatural or supernatural by definition. Analytic philosophers definitionally classify morality as universal. And with that, I yield and thank you.
So here we are, Praise's final slide, the big finish, the grand conclusion. And what does he give us? A philosophical smoothie made of half-understood terms and wishful thinking.
He starts with, just one moral fact needs to be true for moral realism to be true. Okay, that's fine. But then he immediately faceplants by saying, to deny moral facts is itself a moral fact. No, Praise, that's not how propositions work. That's how bumper stickers work.
Then he says, certainty is irrelevant because it's a property of persons, which is a strange thing to say in a debate where he's trying to prove something is objectively true.
And then comes the real comedy. There are no defeaters of divine command theory. Praise, my man. G.E. Moore built his entire moral philosophy as a defeater of divine command theory. It's literally the reason Moore wrote Principia Ethica.
And finally, he appeals to phenomenological conservatism, which basically means, if it seems true and you have no defeaters, you're justified. But Praise does have defeaters. He just didn't read them.
So his conclusion becomes, DCT is justified because I don't know the arguments against it. That's not philosophy. That's selective hearing.
Let's be clear. There are defeaters of divine command theory, and Praise accidentally used one of them in his own presentation.
The defeater comes from G.E. Moore, the philosopher who famously argued that moral properties like goodness and rightness are sui generis, unique, irreducible, and not grounded in God. Moore lays this out in his landmark work Principia Ethica.
And here's the academic irony. Praise quoted Katz's description of Moore's view, but instead of recognizing it as a critique of DCT, he treated it like it was a support for DCT.
Katz is very clear in her dissertation. Her goal is to show that divine command theory is as probable as Moorean realism, not that it replaces Moore, and certainly not that Moore supports Christianity.
But Praise didn't read that part. He grabbed the line describing Moore's atheist moral realism, ignored the context, and then used it to defend the Christian God.
So instead of defending Christian theism, Praise ended up defending the very atheistic moral ontology that Moore used to attack divine command theory in the first place.
And the saddest part? If Praise had actually read Katz's paper, he could have used her arguments to defeat the atheist position, instead of accidentally becoming the atheist position.
Academically speaking, this is what we call a catastrophic misread. Casually speaking, it's what we call a praise moment.
All right, I know we said we were only going to fact-check one scholar, but I cannot let this one slide. Praise says, and I quote, "Moral responsibility requires Kausas sway free will, which M. Suresh showed is an emergent property on immaterial soul." No, absolutely not.
First of all, M. Suresh never mentions Kausas sway free will. Not once. Kausas sway means self-caused, and that's a concept from Spinoza and later libertarian free will debates, not from Suresh.
What Suresh actually discusses is much more modest. He explores the idea that free will might be an emergent property of an immaterial soul. And even then, he doesn't claim to have proven it. He treats it as a philosophical possibility, not a demonstrated fact.
So Praise took a cautious, exploratory paper and inflated it into a definitive proof of a concept the author never even mentioned.
Academically speaking, that's not interpretation, that's imagination. And Praise really should stop confusing the two.
J.M. Katz and many others have shown moral properties such as rightness, wrongness, goodness, and badness, and sui generis properties that are queer, unique, and natural properties. Hence, they are non-natural properties because they are non-reductive, normative, and not discoverable by the scientific method. The fact they violate causal closure principle means they are supranatural or supernatural by definition.
Here we go again. Sui generis properties. Praise's favorite philosophical buzzword. The one he keeps using even though it's the very thing he more used to attack divine command theory.
Seriously, More's whole point in Principia Ethica was that moral properties like goodness and rightness are independent of God, irreducible, and not grounded in anything divine. More used this to undercut DCT, not support it.
So what is Praise doing? Is he arguing for Christianity? Or is he accidentally arguing for atheism? Because he literally says these properties are non-reductive and non-discoverable. If they can't be reduced, and they can't be discovered, then how exactly are they supposed to trace back to the goodness of God?
Praise is basically saying, moral properties float out there in the universe, independent of God, and that proves God. That's not theology. That's a philosophical faceplant.
Now, let's talk about Praise's next mistake, and it's a big one. He applies supernatural or supernatural status to sui generis properties like rightness and goodness.
I get what he's trying to do. He wants to take these moral properties and attach them to a creator God, as if saying supernatural magically makes them divine.
But here's what he completely misses. If you treat sui generis moral properties as supernatural, you don't just get goodness and rightness. You also get badness, wrongness, evilness, viciousness, all as supernatural properties too.
So what kind of God is Praise creating here? A God who contains both goodness and badness as supernatural properties? A God who embodies rightness and wrongness?
This is exactly how you end up with antinomian theology, a theology where moral distinctions collapse, where God's nature becomes morally incoherent, and where commands lose all grounding.
Praise isn't defending Christian theism. He's building a metaphysical monster.
Now, let's slow down and treat this part with the seriousness it deserves. Praise keeps using the word queer as if it's a compliment, but in philosophy, queer has a very specific meaning.
In moral philosophy, a queer property is one that is metaphysically strange, epistemically unexplained, ontologically mysterious, and not reducible to anything else. It's not a positive term, it's a problem that needs explanation.
Katz mentions queer properties because she is explaining More's objection to DCT. She is not endorsing them. She is not celebrating them. She is laying out the challenge that DCT must answer.
And this is where Lambert comes in, a philosopher who argues that if moral properties are truly sui generis, then they exist outside of God. independent of God's nature, and therefore cannot be grounded in God's commands.
And if moral properties exist outside of God, then God's commands do not create moral obligations. They merely report them. That destroys divine command theory at the root.
So when praise embraces sui generis properties and calls them supernatural, he's not defending God. He's placing moral reality above God, which is the exact opposite of Christian theism.
So, let's ask the obvious question. If praise insists that moral properties like rightness, wrongness, goodness, and badness are sui generis, meaning they exist in their own category, independent, irreducible, and outside of anything else, then what does that actually mean for God?
Well, it means exactly what it sounds like. If these moral properties exist before God, outside God, and independent of God, then God is no longer the source of morality. He becomes a subject of morality.
And if God is subject to these independent moral forces, then God is not free. He is not sovereign over morality. He is not the ground of goodness. He is simply another being who must answer to the same sui generis moral facts as everyone else.
That's not Christian theism. That's not divine command theory. That's a metaphysical system where morality sits above God, and God is just trying to keep up.
So yes, by embracing more sui generis moral properties, praise has unintentionally created a God who is not free, not sovereign, and not the foundation of morality. He's created a God who must answer to the very moral forces he claims God created.
And that's the tragic irony. In trying to defend the Christian God, praise ended up building a universe where God himself has a boss.
And Lambert shows, with surgical precision, that Christians should not accept sui generis moral properties. Why? Because they create a devastating dilemma for theism.
Here's the short version. If moral properties like goodness, rightness, and wrongness are sui generis, meaning they exist independently, irreducibly, and outside of God, then Christians face two unacceptable options.
Option 1. God explains why these sui generis properties attach to actions. But if God explains them, then God is involved in explaining his own moral goodness, which makes God's goodness dependent on his will. That's theologically unacceptable.
Option 2. God does not explain why these moral properties attach to actions, but then moral reality exists independently of God, which destroys God's sovereignty and makes morality something God must obey.
And Lambert's conclusion is simple. Christians have good reason to reject sui generis moral properties because they either make God the author of his own goodness, or they place morality above God.
In other words, exactly the problem praise walked straight into.
So, if you want to understand why praise's use of sui generis properties collapses his entire theology, Lambert's paper lays it out beautifully. Link is in the description. Please read it. Praise, you say you're defending free grace, but your sui generis morality just blew up the gospel. Let's talk about how your position turns God's salvation plan into a cosmic lottery, and why Jessica Katz will destroy you in this debate.
Spoiler alert, if morality isn't grounded in God, then neither is salvation. And that's not free grace, that's theological nihilism.
Free grace as salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone, because God defined it that way. But if you say morality is sui generis, independent of God, then faith isn't inherently good. It's just one option God picked. He could have said, sacrifice your firstborn, and that'd be equally good.
So let's get this straight. God could have chosen anything as the path to salvation, torture, genocide, denying the Trinity, and it'd still be good? That's not grace, praise. That's moral chaos. Here's the real problem. If goodness is sui generis, then God's commands aren't authoritative, they're arbitrary. He could have commanded anything, even worship Satan, and it'd still be good, because sui generis morality doesn't care.
So when God says, believe in Jesus, it's not because he's loving and just, it's because he rolled the dice and landed on faith. That's not the gospel. praise. That's theological Russian roulette. Free grace says God's salvation is pure grace, unmerited, undeserved, rooted in his character. But if morality is sui generis, then grace isn't gracious by nature. It's just what God happened to choose. He could have chosen damnation for all, and your sui generis morality would call it good.
Congrats, praise. You just turned the cross into a cosmic coincidence.
Here's the only way out, divine command theory. Katz says morality is grounded in God's nature, so salvation is necessarily good because it reflects who he is.
With DCT, salvation is necessarily gracious because God is love. Faith is inherently virtuous because God's commands flow from his character. The gospel isn't arbitrary, it's the only plan that makes sense for a perfect God.
Imagine believing in a God who literally defines good and evil, but then turning around and saying morality floats out there, untethered to him. That's the mess you get when Christians flirt with sui generis properties.
Like, there's certain moral propositions that are necessarily not natural. Like, it's indisputable pretty much in a lot of philosophy that things like the principles like goodness, badness, rightness, wrongness, that they can't be reduced to anything natural. You can't reduce them. They're normative. And since they are immaterial, you can't investigate them scientifically. That is, by definition, it goes into the supernatural or sui generis properties. I mean, and